Imagine waking up and, well, finding your entire city was just completely rearranged overnight by like a massive earthquake.
Right.
But before anyone can really process it, the government quickly paints the rubble to look like a park. And eventually, everyone just acts like the landscape has always looked that way. I'm your host, and welcome to a new deep dive, one that's specifically tailored for your educational journey.
And I'm your resident historian for today. That mechanism of deliberate forgetting really captures the American historical memory of the Korean War. Today, we are extracting some essential insights from three books: David Halberstam's The Coldest Winter, Stephen Casey's Selling the Korean War, and Bruce Cumings' The Korean War. A history.
Yeah, so our mission today is to look at how this overlooked conflict actually established the modern world. I mean, it fundamentally transformed public propaganda and birthed the national security state.
Exactly. It was the specific catalyst that justified keeping a massive, permanent defense budget, even during peacetime.
Which is wild.
It is. And the groundwork for that transformation started with just massive institutional blind spots. Halberstam's book highlights this severe civil-military dysfunction.
Right, specifically the catastrophic hubris of General Douglas MacArthur, like pushing American forces all the way to the Yali River, right on the Chinese border.
Right, and he did this despite glaring evidence that China was, preparing to intervene.
Yeah, because his intelligence chief, Charles Willoughby, didn't just overlook this data, he actively suppressed it.
Wait, actively suppressed it, like on purpose?
Yes, he was physically altering troop estimates. He was even throwing out interrogation reports from captured Chinese soldiers.
Wow.
All of that just to protect MacArthur's assumption that China wouldn't fight.
That direct manipulation of intelligence created a massive military disaster. But, MacArthur's battlefield failure didn't just stay in Korea.
No, it immediately triggered a crisis back in Washington. Because suddenly, Truman had to figure out how to sell this spiraling conflict to the public.
Right, and Americans were used to the total mobilization of World War II. Unconditional surrender, parades, all of that.
Exactly. Truman, however, wanted to contain the conflict. He really wanted to avoid World War III, which meant fighting for these constrained, ambiguous objectives.
I mean, it is like trying to hype up a massive stadium crowd. But the coach's stated goal is merely to tie the game. Like, how do you mobilize a democracy and ask soldiers to die without the promise of total victory?
Well, you fall into the limited war trap. Casey shows how the Truman administration was just forced to invent new propaganda strategies to manage public frustration.
Oh, yeah. They literally stopped calling it a war.
Right, rebranding it as a police action.
A police action. Just incredible. And they fed the press these carefully sanitized casualty rates. They leaned heavily on ideological fear-mongering about Soviet expansion just to maintain a baseline of domestic support.
But wait, if we bring in Bruce Cumings' book, that entire American justification was based on a flawed premise anyway?
Right, because the public thought they were fighting global communism. But Cumings argues this was actually a deep-seated indigenous civil war.
Yeah, he traces the origins back to the 1930s, framing it as a revolutionary struggle over land reform and decolonization from Japan.
So Cumings just completely reframes the conflict. He strips away that neat 1950 Cold War proxy battle narrative orchestrated by the Soviet Union.
And by documenting the sheer scale of the American air campaign, he exposes a really brutal reality.
Yeah, the stats there are staggering. U.S. bombing destroyed nearly every North Korean city and killed roughly 20% of their population.
But hold on, I want to push back on something here.
Sure, go ahead.
If Cumings is right, and this was fundamentally a local civil war, doesn't that mean the American public who Halberstam and Casey show were mobilized to fight global communism were completely sold a lie? Like, does the Civil War reality invalidate the Cold War justification?
Well, it exposes a violent intersection of different realities. Halberstam and Casey operate on the premise that containing communism was the genuine, if poorly executed, strategic goal of U.S. policymakers.
Right, so they believed their own framework.
Yes. But Cumings insists the intervention was an illegitimate counter-revolution suppressing Korean self-determination. The core insight for any student of history here is seeing how American leaders were so blinded by their global Cold War framework
that they completely misread the local revolutionary social dynamics they were just stepping right into.
Exactly. The political pressure to appear tough on communism drove the military overreach.
While the brutal, on-the-ground reality of the Civil War was just obscured by the government's desperate need to sell a clean, limited conflict at home.
Which brings us right back to your earthquake metaphor from the start. The ground shifted completely in Korea, laying the permanent blueprint for modern defense budgets, limited warfare, and state propaganda.
Yet the public memory simply paved over the cracks.
Precisely.
Which leaves you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to examine today. If a brutal watershed conflict that permanently altered global power dynamics can be so easily and deliberately forgotten.
Right. What current global crises are we already selectively misremembering today just to protect our own comfortable national narratives?